All right, today we are going to learn about the Indian Wars. So just a quick recap. Yesterday we talked about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and this westward expansion and Manifest Destiny and the Homestead Act that gave us the reason and the way to get out west. So the essential question for today that I want you to think about while we're going through this lesson is, what would you do to protect your way of life? What would you do to protect your way of life, your home, your culture, your peace of mind, whatever you feel like is a part of your way of life? What would you do to protect it and make sure that it remain preserved? So think about that as we're talking about this Indian Wars period. So those are the standards that we're going to address today. You can take a look at those and read them on your own. In the PowerPoint, there is a video that kind of introduces this Plains Indians Wars. I want you to make sure that you watch that. It's fairly short. It's just a couple minutes, but make sure you take a look at that and watch that, because it's going to give you like a brief introduction overview of kind of how all of this goes. And then I'm going to break down right now some of the key parts of this Indian Wars era. So, Native Americans and the policy of removal. So remember, in 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed, and it was the exchange of Indian lands in the South for lands in modern-day Oklahoma. The Supreme Court case that was ruled on in 1832, Worcester versus Georgia, ruled that because the Cherokee Nation was a separate political entity, it could not be regulated by the state of Georgia. And then 1838 was that infamous Trail of Tears, which is a big result of this Indian Removal Act. U.S. soldiers forced 16,000 Cherokees from southeast to Oklahoma. There were 4,000 and probably even more than that casualties. So 4,000 deaths, okay? And then in 1842, the Seminoles were forced to leave Florida. So the Native Americans have been moved and pushed and moved and pushed and moved and pushed. Okay. Then they settle into this area, the Great Plains area that we talked about, which is this modern day Oklahoma area, things like places like that. But now we've got this Manifest Destiny idea, and we've got this westward expansion that's happening with the Transcontinental Railroad, as well as the Homestead Act that is bringing settlers into Native American land and territory and area. By 1851, the federal government had begun to restrict Indians into even smaller areas. Okay, so think about that question. What would you do to preserve your way of life or protect your way of life? They've already been moved from their land, lost thousands of people, and now they have all of this land. They're comfortable there. They're good there. They're like, okay, we're cool. And now the government comes in and starts to restrict them into even smaller areas of land. By the 1860s, they were forced onto reservations. They're no longer free to roam the plains. They were not denied access to the buffalo. Remember yesterday we talked about the buffalo and how they use the buffalo for many, many different things. Buffalo is a huge part of the source for a lot of different things like lodging, clothing, food, and tools. The buffalo herds were destroyed. The settlers that came in and the U.S. government that came in and destroyed the buffalo herds, they wasted the meat. They killed primarily for just the hide or their skin, and for sport, just for the fun of hunting as a sport. The settlers also brought diseases to the area, which was very detrimental to the Native Americans as well. So not only are we forcing them to live on smaller areas, no longer free to roam, destroying their resources, but also bringing diseases and killing them as well. So the Native Americans are going through a very rough time yet again. So after the Civil War, the U.S. engaged in a number of conflicts with over 250,000 Native Americans living west of the Mississippi. And this becomes known as the Indian Wars. The primary issue of the Indian Wars was obviously land. And with that land came resources and things like that. The U.S. government had made several treaties with Native American tribes to find Indian lands. Well, what's a treaty? Well, remember, a treaty is some sort of peace agreement. Usually we think of treaties when we think of wars ending, because treaties generally end a war, but they can also be just a peace agreement or some type of agreement in general between two opposing parties. So the government has made all of these promises in these treaties and then have broken these promises. And so as more and more settlers start to come in that Native American territory, these treaties are often ignored or broken by the government because they want what they want and they'll take it at any cost. The Sand Creek Massacre is a huge event of the Indian Wars time period. So the Sand Creek Native Reserve was set aside for especially the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes through the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. So the local chief, Black Kettle, went to the local army seeking protection from the settlers. Colonel John Chivington was given the order to make the natives pay by the federal government, and his band of militia, and militia just means volunteer military, opened fire on unarmed natives. They were attacked and killed, many women and children and unarmed natives. In hope of diffusing the situation, Black Kettle raised an American flag as a sign of friendship, and kind of like, if you've ever heard that term, waving the white flag is kind of surrendering, but that was ignored. And so this was a huge massacre. This wasn't even a battle. This was just a massacre. This was a takeout. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. So a different treaty from the Sand Creek Massacre, but still kind of these same things. So the government agrees not to build road through the Sioux, that's how you say that word, Sioux territory, and to abandon 3 U.S. forts. Sioux and others agreed to live on reservations with support from the federal government, saying that they would give them schools and other communal buildings. So the government says, okay, we are not going to build a road. We're not going to build a form of transportation through your territory, and we're going to leave. And the Sioux say, okay, cool. Y'all do this. We will live on these reservations that you've given us. Just give us some of the things like schools and other communal buildings and communal spaces that you've promised us. Everybody's like, cool, we're good to go. Well, obviously that treaty is violated. It was supposed to just create one large reservation in the West. So creating this big reservation here. Americans needed only routes westward, not actual settlements. So Americans just needed to have a way to get further west, not actually settle. But of course, what ended up happening? Well, white settlers began to settle on reservation lands. And natives continued to hunt on white territories outside of the treaty guidelines. But it's like, y'all didn't stick with your part, so we didn't stick with our part kind of thing. So it's a whole mess. The Red River Wars. The Apache and Comanche natives violently defended their territories in Texas and Oklahoma. They were concerned about the butcher of the buffalo. And so this photo over here to the right, this is all buffalo hides. So just showing how many buffalo were hunted and killed and wasted. So even friendly natives were attacked. The U.S. herded them into reservations, and the army attacked and killed violent natives. This ended the reign of the 2 tribes mentioned above in the Southwest. It also brought about this destruction of the buffalo. So their resources are being greatly destroyed as well. And you have to remember, they don't just use the buffalo for hunting purposes just for food. The Native Americans use them for a whole slew of things: shelter, storage, things like that. And so they're depleting their very valuable resource to them. The Battle of Little Bighorn. So the Indian Wars era was actually a complete loss, obviously, for the Native Americans, but there were a few battles that were victories, and this is one of those. So one thing about this Indian Wars period that you have to think about is that all Native Americans don't share the exact same culture, language, whatever. So you've got all of these different tribes, and they're fighting individually a lot of times, which is one of the reasons why they are so overpowered. Not just that, you've got the U.S. Army that's bringing in more advanced weapons that the Native Americans just don't have. So the Sioux and Cheyenne tribes were upset about continued violations of the Black Hills Area Reservation. They were attacked numerous times. On June 25th, 1876, Civil War veteran George Custer attacked over 2,000 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors with a few hundred men. So you got 2,000 Native Americans, over 2,000, so thousands of Native Americans and just a few hundred men. Custer and his men were overwhelmed and every single one of them were killed. So everybody was killed on the U.S. Army side, including General Custer. So this also becomes known as Custer's Last Stand. And it's one of the most famous Native American victories of this time, of this era, because there weren't very many. So when there were, they were big. And one of the big reasons for it was because instead of fighting individually, they decided to come together. So the Dawes Act is passed by the U.S. government, and Congress wanted to assimilate. Assimilate is a term that just means to become a part of, to be absorbed. So they wanted to assimilate the Native Americans into American culture and way of life. So a big part of culture we know is language, education, dress, food, all of these different things. It gave each Native American head of household 160 acres of reservation land for farming. They couldn't practice their religion, they couldn't use their own language or dress, and they must teach their children to be Americans. So this photo up here at the top right, this is Native Americans, but clearly they are not in traditional Native American dress like in this poster here. And so this is a good example of assimilation, when you drop your culture to become part of another culture. And so the whole purpose of this Dawes Act was to assimilate the Native Americans, to Americanize them. Wounded Knee. So natives were practicing the ancient tradition of the ghost dance. And this is just a religious tradition. This is a religious revival that basically called on the ancestors to come back and bring back their way of life. Get rid of these white settlers, give us back our buffalo that are so valuable to us, and give us back our way of life. If you recall, Native Americans are very spiritual. They believe in a lot of rituals that will do a lot of different things. Okay. The white settlers were really freaked out by this ghost dance. So troops went to stop the ghost dance practice. They demanded the natives give up their weapons. Shots rang out. Troops opened fire. 300 unarmed natives were killed. This is the last great native massacre and war, and this officially ends this Indian War era. Okay, so Wounded Knee is the official end of the Indian Wars era. And this causes a huge wipeout of Native Americans in addition to all of the other ones. So overall, the Native Americans lost the war and the white settlers came in and took over and killed and destroyed and all of these different things. And even to this day, Native Americans living on reservations are still struggling. Unemployment, poverty is super high in those areas, as well as addiction is a big part of problems in those areas as well. So today's activity. So I hope you were thinking about throughout this, what would you do to protect your way of life? You know, we argued that, well, I wouldn't fight back. Well, they shouldn't have fought back, or da-da-da-da-da. But eventually, if you keep pushing someone, they're going to push back at some point. So with this, we're going to look at this assignment. You're going to fill out a table that is really comparing the lifestyles of Native Americans and the white settlers. So why did the different lifestyles, so think about this while you're doing this activity, why did the different lifestyles of the Indians and white Americans lead to conflict on the plains? Okay, so let's take a look at what this worksheet looks like. So the worksheet looks like this. It's just a map. You're going to use, it's just a table. And so you have to look at these different areas: warfare, land ownership, conservation, animals, bravery, and religion. You can use this concept map, which is linked in there. So this is the white settlers' way of thinking on different things, and then the Native Americans' way of thinking on different things, as well as all the things that we've talked about to complete the map, to complete the table. Then answer this question at the end. The land was the biggest cause of conflict between the Native Americans and whites. Do you agree or disagree? And explain your answer. Okay, and you'll just type that into the table and then the answer down there below.